MakeReal specialises in creating immersive learning solutions across a range of technologies. To download their latest academic paper on how to turn learners into activists, visit makereal.co.uk/activists. In a recent webinar organised by friend of the podcast Leonard Hooks, the panellists joked that the real problem of the modern university, to borrow the words of Edward O. Wilson, is Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions and godlike technology. So with the technology getting more and more godlike, what does the university look like in the future? Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
Welcome to the first episode of this 8th season of The Learning Hack, and we're kicking off with an absolute legend. You might have thought that pioneering a transformative HE innovation like the MOOC would be enough for one lifetime, but our guest this time continues to explore and advance the use of technology in education. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of FACT, who is he?
Hack Facts.
Stephen Downes is a prominent figure in the field of educational technology and learning. He is known for his work on open educational resources, digital learning and the development of the MOOC, which stands for Massive Open Online Course. Downes has been a researcher and developer at the National Research Council of Canada and the Canada Institute for Educational Technology, and is currently a researcher at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto.
So, Jay Curtis, Head of Themes. What did we talk about?
MOOCs have been going for a while now, and they've changed a huge amount from the model Stephen Downes, together with George Siemens, originally laid down. So you got his reaction to those changes. But the bulk of the interview was given over to 3 current technologies that he believes will shake up education and learning: the Metaverse, blockchain and AI. Those are all things we've covered on the podcast before, aren't they, John?
Yes, they are, Jay, but I don't think I've ever heard anybody string those 3 technologies together in quite the way Stephen does to give us a picture of how education could function in the future. Stephen Downes is something of an idealist, a techno-optimist. Things might not work out the way he envisions, just as MOOCs maybe didn't. But before anything can move forward, you need a vision, an aspiration for how things could be better than they are today. So we think it's well worth listening to what Stephen Downes has to say. But first, we put a lot of thought and care into our podcasts. As a team, we're striving always to improve what we do and to bring in new ideas, to take it to new places. Last year, we took it to Berlin. This year, we're planning more trips abroad because we have listeners all over the world now. Above all, we want to sustain the Learning Hack into the future because so many listeners have told us that what we do is a public service, a real benefit to the profession. So that's why we're starting up a Patreon, so you can contribute to keeping the show on the road, and for the price of a monthly cup of coffee, get bonus episodes, the chance to connect, and get forward notice of what we have coming up, and a load of other benefits we haven't figured out yet. Go to patreon.com/learninghack and help to keep the vibe alive. Dr. Stephen Downes, it's a great honour to have you on the podcast. Welcome to The Learning Hack.
Thanks. Not doctor.
Okay.
I am unqualified to study my own work.
Oh, right. Okay. You are, however, a great mind on learning and will at some point have your work discussed on our sister podcast, Great Minds on Learning. But it's great to have you here on The Learning Hack and for an in-person interview. Your twin claims to fame are generally listed as co-invention of the MOOC and the theory of connectivism, both results of a collaboration with George Siemens, who's previously been a guest on the Learning Hack podcast. I won't ask you to explain connectivism, as George has already done that, and people can look that one up. But I'd really like to know how you feel about the current state of MOOCs. You ran the first one in 2008, and it was a C MOOC, i.e. one influenced by the principles of connectivism, and not all MOOCs have followed the same pattern. So I'd be interested to get your reaction to the current state of MOOCs. How do you feel about today's MOOCs?
Well, that's an interesting question to start off. the what happened, as you know, is that most MOOCs that followed ours were what were called XMOOCs, which means that they were developed on a fairly traditional model of courses as a sequence of readings and activities, and evaluated with tests, which meant that parameters for successful MOOCs included things like course completion, certificates granted, etc. Our MOOCs were very different. They were based on participation, interaction, bringing in material from a variety of sources. They weren't linear. They were kind of like this horrible mess. So the state of MOOCs as a horrible mess is about right. No, I'm just kidding. So the XMOOCs went about as you would expect. They were big for a while. They were made free for a while, but ultimately the business model didn't support them because they were based on a single point of production, which created significant hosting expenses and significant production expenses, which meant they needed a business model. And these business models, for the most part, weren't forthcoming. And they tended to be, sort of side projects of commercial institutions. Mm-hmm. And so they've just joined the realm of traditional courses. Big deal. There is continuing activity in the area of CMOOCs, to my experience. I've covered it in some recent papers, for example, recent work in connectivism. And it's an ongoing area of inquiry. Is it big and huge the way XMOOCs were? No. But is it an ongoing productive area of research? I think so. And a lot of the stuff that's happening since, everything from the learning experience platform to the Fediverse, really is an outcome of that work from the CMOOC. Now, it's not a direct causal, CMOOC caused this, CMOOC caused that, because the world doesn't work that way. But certainly CMOOCs were a precursor to that. And I think that as a research area is, a living prospect. And I still expect more from that in the future. These things take time, though. The future is a lot slower than people think it is.
It is. So doesn't it move by creeps and jerks? Some things happen a lot quicker than you'd expected. Like, I don't know, ChatGPT suddenly came up over Christmas. Other things just seem to take forever, and you kind of almost give up on them. Anyway, in our Great Minds on Learning podcast, we talk about theories of learning a lot. And in that regard, I noticed you gave a really interesting definition of learning in a talk you gave to SUNY in 2017 that people can look up on YouTube. What you said was, knowledge is the physical state of the brain. So to learn, what you're actually doing is changing the physical state of the brain. And you give a really interesting example of learning to be a surfer, which kind of puts it into a very experiential sort of mode. Mm-hmm. So how does that vision of learning relate to how we actually do it now in institutions, most usually in educational institutions and in workplace learning?
Well, that was one of the really big differences between the XMOOC and the CMOOC, because the traditional perspective of learning is the idea that we in some way create or acquire knowledge. In other words, some sort of representational state in the mind, usually based out of a physical symbol system, where, sure, we may have neurons and all of that, but what we really have are sentences and propositions which refer to the real world, maybe true or false. And there's all kinds of difficulties with that model, which I won't get into here because we only have 40 minutes. And I don't think that universities yet really accept what I consider to be a fact, that learning is actually the production of a physical state in the mind, a physical state in the brain, and specifically a particular network of connections, which can be described as links between neurons, activation values of neurons, strengths of these connections, etc. So they don't attempt to produce a method of learning which corresponds to that fact. And so there's a dissonance. There's still an awful lot of failure in traditional universities, not just MOOCs, where you see a lot of failure and lack of course completion. It's traditional university, and really, it's a separate issue from what we're talking about. But it really is an economic and even moral issue for universities. How can you charge students all this money and then fail them? Like, what are you doing? And that has always struck me as wrong.
Yeah. So what the example you gave of somebody learning to surf was really interesting because, people get out there on the board and they fail again.
Yeah.
And they watch other people in the peer group who are better. They kind of swap tips and tricks and so on. And gradually, bit by bit, this kind of changes the connections in the brain. I think what you're saying is, this process of kind of experimentation, conversation, community, and so on. Is there a kind of analog in something which is not a physical process, like learning a sport like surfing?
Sure. Let's take computer programming.
Yeah.
Because this is something in which I participate on both sides, if you will, as teacher and student. And aside from a couple of courses when I was young, I've taken very little formal education in computer programming. Everything I know about computer programming has been a result of that kind of process. Trial and error. Look at what people have done, try it for myself. Look at what people have done, try it for myself. And the point is that producing learning should kind of look like that. I have a series of videos on YouTube I call Stephen Follows Instructions. They're a series of hilarious failures because the instructions out there on the internet aren't very good. But what I'm trying to do with that series is show what my thought process is as I work through these problems. And, people probably certainly they don't watch those videos on real speed. They probably double, triple the speed. And they're really boring videos. But the intent here is to model a process where you're showing how you think through a problem, rather than just telling people how to get to the answer, because the process to get to the answer almost never simply works in the real world. There's always something else that confounds how you're going to get to the answer. So you can't just think of learning things as, you do this series of steps and get to the answer. And that's especially true in computer programming, because so many types of computers, so many languages, so many other variables, you really have to get a feel for it. And this feel is what happens when your brain achieves that particular physical state, in my opinion, anyways. And just as a caveat, all of this needs to be empirically shown, right? I mean, I'm not here proclaiming the truth. This is a proposal and a description of what ought to be an empirical research agenda, and not me saying this is it.
Okay. Interesting, really interesting summary there. With that in mind, we met at Online Educa in Berlin for Christmas. And shortly after that, I see you gave a talk to the Catalan Pedagogical Society called Universities at the Crossroads, which I thought was fascinating. I looked it up on YouTube. In that talk, you described how you see the three current technologies, not current technologies, not future technologies, Metaverse, blockchain, and artificial intelligence, impacting the traditional role and function of universities. I thought it's so interesting and enlightening, challenging as well for many, that I'd like to devote the rest of this interview to all three of those technologies and your thought about them. Because all three of them have implications for learning that we do attempt to track on our two podcasts, this one and also Great Minds. For instance, we had an episode about the Metaverse in the last season. So firstly, let's start with Metaverse. You gave an explanation in that talk of how Metaverse relates to current learning modes like VR and AR that really opened my eyes. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So most people characterize the Metaverse in terms of the technology, like virtual reality, wearing the face mask and all of that. And that's part of it. But what makes the metaverse, properly so called, distinct from the many, many other efforts to do virtual reality, everything from active worlds to Second Life, is the persistence of objects. And so the metaverse really is virtual reality, augmented reality, extended reality, etc., plus persistence. And what I mean by persistence here is that when you go into a virtual world and I go into a virtual world and we look at an object, it's the same object. And when we come back tomorrow and look at that object, it's still the same object. The object has an independent, well, I don't want to say an independent existence. That's maybe a bit too strong, but the object has, well, persistence over time and persistence in place in this virtual world. And that's how the metaverse can be about real things. That's the connection between the metaverse and the rest of the world.
So to kind of give an example of that, perhaps, for people who may have messed around with Second Life a few years ago, you'll go to Second Life, you buy a load of clothes, rather unpleasant clothes, and gestures and things like this. You buy them with your Linden dollars. But when you pretty soon get tired of Second Life and go away, all that stuff is kind of trashed. However, in the metaverse, you've still got those, those kind of unpleasant clothes and haircuts and gestures as well, and your avatar persists from one to another, and that you see as being it's that a necessary condition for metaverse really being metaverse, because there is a kind of there's a land grab on, isn't there, to kind of claim.
Well, I mean, everybody and their dog is trying to define what the metaverse is, and these definitions, I don't want to say they're all self-serving, because some of them aren't, but a lot of them are, and they're defining the metaverse in terms of whatever is interesting to them. I don't have, if you will, a dog in this hunt. Is that a good expression? I don't know if that's a good expression.
Dog in this fight, I've usually heard it as.
Oh, yeah, dog in this fight. Right.
It's more unpleasant metaphor, I think.
Which is more unpleasant. Like, dog in this hunt isn't that great either, but But yeah, anyhow, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But it's better than the expression skin in the game. I hate that expression. It's just like, anyhow. So yeah, I mean, there is this land grab. But it's interesting because we have to think now about how it is that we make these objects persistent. Presumably, there has to be minimally a syntactic commonality of the object from one place to the next, not necessarily a semantic compatibility. I'll give you an example, emoticons. An emoticon is a syntactic structure, as a little sequence of code, not very big, that is used by different websites and different applications. So Facebook, Twitter, etc. That syntactic structure is the same for all of those. So we can have this common vocabulary. But what we should call the interpretation or the semantic structure of that differs. It looks different. The same maple leaf emoticon as viewed on Twitter looks different from the one that you see on Facebook, looks different from the one that you see on a Samsung device, looks different from the one you see in Firefox. So the semantic interpretation can vary. Syntactic structure needs to be the same. There's a huge, deep lesson in that. Just talking about what is required for governance and compatibility among peoples. But we'll leave that as a bracketed aside. So that's one thing. Persistence also means, to some degree, immutability, right? That syntactic structure needs to be the same the next time, or if there are changes to it, these are changes that need to be not necessarily explainable because it's really complex, but have provenance. You can describe what happened to the thing while you were gone, and describe it in a syntactic way. These are hard challenges. And that's why we don't yet have a metaverse, right? And you know, that, the land grab, partially it's about these syntactic structures. Who defines that? Partially it's about how we design the provenance. Who can have an impact on one of these things? Who can make a change? And you think this is all abstract, but abstract, airy fairy. But think of something really practical like a learning resource, right? Say, I don't know, say a 3D rendition of a dog. That's a learning resource. That's how we learn about dogs, let's say. A dog should have certain syntactic structures: 4 legs, a head, bark, etc. Can be interpreted in different ways. We see one type of dog here, another type of dog here. Who gets to define what a dog is? Who gets to define what a particular dog is? How do you know it's the same dog from here to there? If you're learning about a dog, you need your concept of dog to be consistent across environments. How do you define that? That, I think, is where the land grab is. And these are hard, abstract problems that manifest in really concrete ways.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's throwing up a lot of things for me. One is it reminds me of how people coalesced around technology standard like SCORM in learning eventually. Very imperfect, but it stuck, and we've still got it, and it kind of worked, and an industry was built off the back of it, which we all now know and love. And another thing it's making me think, yes, okay, being sarcastic there.
Let's think about SCORM for a second, because your analogy is entirely apt. SCORM was something that wasn't the result of a grassroots process. SCORM was designed and implemented. It has, as you know, a history in things like advanced distributed learning specifications, or the aviation industry CDT.
Yeah,
exactly. So it was created by standards bodies and then deployed. And that's, for example, the exact opposite of language, which is created by people and then gradually over time formalized. And you get two different systems if you develop it in these different ways. So a lot of things that I talk about, especially when I talk about CMOOCs, connectivism, and all that, are things that are ground up, bottom up. We're looking at practice and actual connections between actual people and actual things first, and then we gradually standardize and formalize. I don't want to say it's like paving the cow paths, because that's not quite right for a variety of reasons. But it is the recognition and the formalization of actual practices. And that's the distinction that I would draw between protocols on the one hand and standards on the other hand. And a big question, and I'm only thinking of this now, but it's kind of relevant. The big question regarding the metaverse is, will it be based on protocols? Will it be based on standards? And that question resolves to, will it belong to people, or will it belong to companies like Facebook who create and enforce standards? And you can see how we get two very different ideas of a metaverse if we look at it that way. And again, that has profound implications for education, because, who defines education? Is it something that the people define? Is it a protocol, or is it a standard? Standardized education, again, whole other discussion, is something very different from what we might call a common law education. An education designed for a specific purpose is very different from an education that sort of captures what the practice is of the day.
Yeah. Another thing that what you said makes me think of is we're kind of leaning towards blockchain, but I don't quite get there yet. I'm not
trying to go there, but yeah.
But before we get there, another thing that it makes me think of is the idea that one would have, something which you might call a learning passport, that your learning in one institution will be and your achievements and so on will be portable and persistent in the digital realm beyond that. And people have been trying to make this work for a long time. I remember the interest, early discussions with British educationalists in government institutions who were trying to get a learning passport going in the early 2000s. And then we had the whole badges thing and so on. So that would seem to be an example of something that persisted. Are you more optimistic that this can actually work within the metaverse?
Yeah, and there's also the whole Bologna process in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on. The bodies in the United States that recognize and credential institutions, the accreditation boards in Canada, so on. The problem with credentials is they're formalized abstractions of something very complex. Think what a Bachelor of Arts signifies, right? And do it like a philosopher, right? Ask yourself, if somebody has a BA, what states of affairs in the world does that stand for? You can't even begin to list that. And so it's very difficult to create an actual agreement on such a credential. We can do it, again, to come back to this original distinction, we can do it syntactically, right? And that's what digital badges are. Digital badges are a syntactic structure which describe a framework that you can use to exchange credentials. But the question of interpretation is the big one, and people interpret these things differently. They think that knowing how to code HTML, for example, means something different. I mentioned that because I did a test on LinkedIn yesterday. Do I know how to code HTML? Which I thought was pretty interesting. And the end result was a badge on my profile, which I did succeed at. But what I found interesting is to get that badge, I had to score better on the test, which was a very good test. But better on the test, or I had to be like top 30%. So better on the test than 70% of the people who took the test. So if I were smart, I'd get a whole bunch of fifth graders in there to try to take that test. And then I'd take the test.
Yeah, that's what we call gaming. That's what we call gaming the test.
Yeah. So these questions of interpretation. And so, okay. So we ask, well, what does it matter? Well, who are these credentials for? Because it doesn't end with the credential. What is the application to which the credential will be put? Well, 90% or whatever, it's picking a figure out of the air, but we could measure that empirically. The use of credentials will be for employment, right? Well, why do they need a credential? Well, because they need shorthand. Why do they need shorthand? Because there's just too much stuff to try to assess for yourself. So, okay, well, that's fine. But if we can't formalize this interpretation, they don't know what the credential means. They don't know what the provenance of it is. They don't know what the quality of it is. They don't know what the validity of the testing is. These questions all remain, as we saw in my LinkedIn credential. All of these questions remain. So again, persistence isn't semantic persistence. It can't be, it never will be. It can only be syntactic persistence, but syntactic persistence is not enough for credentialing. You need interpretation. So I don't see any of this stuff, blockchain, etc., as a solution to credentialing. People keep doing this. There are, I saw an article, it comes up every once in a while, talking about the hundreds of thousands of credentials now in the world. What digital credentials have done, they've made it possible for anyone to create a credential. On the one hand, it's great. I can now have as much degree granting status as a university, although without recognition by a government, you know what I mean. But we've created an impossible situation for employers. So if you're an employer, what are you going to do? It's a mess, right? And it's getting worse every year. Well, what you're going to do, if you can, is look at the prospective employee directly and see what their actual qualities and attributes are. Can they program HTML? Really? Etc. But again, there are too many people to do that. It would take forever. If you've gone through a hiring process, the interviewing takes days, weeks. It's a miserable process.
Yeah.
Enter AI. And basically, AI will shortcut all of this. The syntactic part will be people can create their own digital objects of whatever they are. And we can talk about that and present them out to the world as a portfolio or whatever for people to see. Employers will scan these portfolios using AI and find the people with the demonstrated skills that fit their positions. In other words, in the way I say this in slogan form, the credential of the future will be a job offer. So it's interesting. The effective end of credentialing, or the credentialing monopoly that universities have, will be it won't be that some other credentialing system replaces it. It'll be that we don't need these abbreviations anymore. We have AI that can handle the complexity of the information that we're dealing with.
In the struggle against the forgetting curve that learning people are engaged in every day, there are no magic formulas, but there is science. For well over a century, psychologists have known that the spacing effect unlocks deep learning and helps learners power through to peak performance. And yet who uses it, despite the fact that modern learning systems like LXPs make it almost easy? I've written a white paper with Learning Pool that shows how you can use the spacing effect to beat the forgetting curve. Download it now. The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. We've covered blockchain on the Learning Hack and its relevance to learning a couple of times. But no one we've talked to so far, although they're very interesting, has really joined the dots for me between blockchain and learning. Your talk did, the talk I was referring to earlier on YouTube. The subject gets very detailed, but can you lay out in broad lines how you see it impacting education and learning?
Okay, yeah. All right, let's first of all understand what blockchain is. And here's the 10-cent version. Blockchain is a way of creating data records such that, first of all, they are chained together. And secondly, as a result of that chaining, the records cannot be changed. So blockchain is a mechanism for creating persistence. Forget about the rest of it, Bitcoin, all of that. That's what it is. Okay, so that's the technical method. And then the social part of blockchain is, how do you know which chain is the real chain? And so the second part of blockchain is a consensus algorithm in which the people involved agree that one of these chains is the correct chain. So, and that's it. That's blockchain, the 10-cent version. How they do this is really fascinating. The data structures that they use are really fascinating. The data structures are interesting because we've been talking about syntactic structures and persistence and all of that. These data structures create that persistence. So anywhere you need persistence, that kind of data structure will do the job. Now, I'm being very vague about what I mean by that kind of data structure, because ultimately it doesn't matter. what matters is that it have these properties, that it's chained and that it's persistent, that it is, as they say, a directed acyclic graph. It's a set of connections between entities that is directed. They're one-way connections, and they're acyclic. They don't cycle back on each other.
They
go
go one way.
forward through time, right? It's kind of like a history, right? And if you've got a history, you can do all kinds of things. Now, everything from publishing to journal articles to the production of artifacts to land records, etc. All of these need that kind of data structure. So that kind of data structure is very important in the representation of knowledge. Just as an aside, I know we talked about knowledge and learning as being physical structures in the brain, but knowledge and learning can also exist at a social level. These are the physical structures in the social brain. And you need these physical structures. And they are physical structures. People talk about them like, they're algorithms and stuff, but they are actual physical structures. Without the physicality of it, you don't have a blockchain. That's why it's an environmental issue as well.
Yeah.
The second part, and the really interesting part, is the consensus part, how we agree on what is the correct chain. In something I did a few years ago called e-learning 3.0, one of the revelations that came to me, and I'm not sure the world sees it this way, and that's fine, is that the definition of community is consensus. In other words, it's not that we agree on the same things. It's not that we're the same as each other, that we live together or speak the same language or follow the same religion or anything like that. It's that we're all part of the same method of determining, if you will, a source of truth. In other words, it's the same consensus mechanism. That's what creates a community. So it's a community defined by the way we interact with each other, as compared to community according to how we resemble each other. See the distinction?
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting.
So, and that and if we think of it that way, then each of the major disciplines that we have, physics, economics, geology, engineering, these different communities are different ways, are different ways of determining what's true. And it takes us back to the whole concept of a scientific paradigm is defined by Kuhn. It's not so much that they all agree on the same set of facts, although often they do. It's that they have the same method of determining what is a fact. The scientific method, for example, is more important than the series of scientific facts. When we teach these days, we're so focused on the facts. What are the facts? It doesn't matter what the facts are. The facts change. What matters is how do we interact together to get to some sort of consensus on how we determine what is true. And that is much more important, not only for learning, but for society.
Okay, so take a step back. You've got the metaverse. What it needs is persistence. You've got this technology, blockchain, which is all about persistence. So you kind of put those two things together. They obviously sit together very much. Cometh the hour, cometh the technology, and blockchain is the one to make the metaverse work. And you join the dots for me. Moving on to the third one that you talk about, artificial intelligence. This again was interesting for me. Over Christmas, I saw a lot of people on Twitter and LinkedIn experimenting with ChatGPT.
Isn't that fun?
It's really caught people's imagination. That was the toy we got for Christmas more than anything under the Christmas tree, it feels like.
Yeah.
It's a new development in AI called generative AI. Can you kind of make clear the difference between that and what we had before, and then how you see that impacting education and learning?
Well, I mean, in an important sense, it's not different. In an important sense, it's the same. But
Mm.
okay, there's always a few ways to do
Yeah.
this. First of all, old AI, traditional, or as they say, good old-fashioned AI, go fight, is based on rules and representations. It's AI in physical symbol systems. It's AI based on condition action rules, for example, sequences of statements. It's like Lisp, list processing software. You have a bunch of rules, you apply those rules to a body of data, and out springs intelligence. That failed miserably. It had some modest successes, but ultimately it was a failure. And I think there are big implications of that. But what replaced it, contemporary AI, is based on neural networks, almost entirely. It begins with machine learning, which is in itself not neural networks, but a bunch of statistical methods. But if you take machine learning and you extend it to what is called deep learning, now you're in the world of neural networks. And these neural networks aren't programmed, they're trained. And basically, and this will sound familiar to you, you give them a whole bunch of data, and the individual nodes in these networks form connections between each other. Now, in a sense, they're digital connections, so they're not real connections. But on the other hand, something that's digital has to be real, otherwise it doesn't exist. So they're actually connections between entities. These connections between the entities form what we call a model. And it's these pre-trained models that are being used by systems like GPT-3 to do these fantastic things. And the neat thing is you can take these models and apply them without a whole lot of pre-training to novel situations. So ChatGPT, you have the model, you feed it something. Every time you feed it something, it comes out with some results. Now, I'm grossly simplifying it.
Okay.
What was new, part two, is in what these kind of models could do. So previously, they were used for description of data sets, categorization or generalization, clustering of different groups in these data sets. Sometimes they could be used to make predictions. And so, and there were previously a lot of uses in that, predicting when an engine part might fail, for example, or predicting when a stock market indicator might rise, stuff like that. The new thing is now they can actually generate new content. It's still the same sort of thing, but they're using what are called large language models. And basically, you give them a sequence of text, and it's kind of like they're predicting what will come next. Or you give them an image or a sequence of images, and they're predicting what will come next. But by predicting what will come next, they're generating something novel. And you give them a short thing, they can predict, and then predict, and then predict, and then predict, and they can produce a whole body of text. That's new. That's this year. There were, indications of that in the past, but this year, that's when that became popular. And just bonus to your answer, what's coming after that, I believe, are what I call deontic analytics.
Deontic, Deontic. You heard it here first, folks.
Deontic analytics, and that's not just that they predict what will be. It's not that they just create something now. It's that they say what should be the case, what would be better, And you can imagine the applications of that, right? What would be the morally right response to this situation? What would be the best policy decision given these considerations? How should I discipline an employee for this particular infraction? What ought to be an infraction in our employment context? What counts as plagiarism and what doesn't? What does a good answer to the question look like? And these are the sorts of decisions, they're decisions about values that we think are typically reserved for humans. But, Kant says ethics is the result of rational inquiry. These things can do rational inquiry, so they can do ethics.
I might say that this feels a bit like a step a bit further and perhaps science fiction, and maybe it won't happen so quickly if I hadn't been so knocked out by Chat GPT. I mean, for quite a while now, for several years now, I've used AI to generate transcripts, subtitling, that kind of thing. Here's an audio file, turn it into written prose, and it's always been it's been about 80% there for quite a long time, and it didn't seem to be getting any better. The big moment for me came when I dumped one of these transcripts into Chat GPT and said, turn that into reasonable English and correct it. And what came back was better than something I might have given to a marketing exec and said, do that editing job on it.
That was a smart idea doing that.
That knocked my socks off. I'm using one type of AI to correct what another type of AI does. And the result is not just 20% better. It's okay, this is where humans' jobs start to go. And already I'm starting to get, because I get a lot of kind of marketing spam, I'm starting to get marketing spam about how we can use ChatGPT to fill in regular kind of marketing jobs, like sending people, just give me ChatGPT, give me 5 headlines for blogs with these keywords in them, that kind of SEO-driven stuff we all do, and then write the blog post for me, and they're better than some of the blog posts. ChatGPT writes better blog posts than some of the rubbish I get, I have to say. That has kind of knocked me over that. So when you say that Deontic is the next step on from that, I'm no longer skeptical that could be the case in a few years' time. So how is that going to impact learning?
$64 question, right?
Yeah. I've seen how it impacts my discipline of marketing. How about learning?
Well, again, what is it to learn, right? The whole thing is, and it's interesting because these neural networks. Oh, squirrel! Sorry, squirrel out the window.
Yeah, I was back in that film Up there. There's a bit where they have the dogs. And
You have to expect that from an interview with me. Okay. They learn the same way humans learn, pretty much, which is kind of interesting because the same things we use to train them can be used to train ourselves. So let's look at a few things that are not happening with ChatGPT. One thing is actual practice at things. And this will be an extension, right? The embodiment of AI, where you have AI that doesn't just do manipulations with language. It's kind of like Chat GPT is what we get if all you do is learn from lectures. That's a quotable, right? So we see the obvious gaps in their knowledge, the practical, they don't know that bricks are heavier than feathers, for example. Nobody's told them, so they'll make mistakes like that. We sometimes approach this through actually giving people experience in the field. We sometimes approach this by creating knowledge structures in society. And these kind of things will continue to be needed for AI. And it's going to be hard for them to produce them themselves, right? Because the AI would have to produce an entire society that creates these things. as we have, in order to get this public knowledge. And they're not going to do that in the short term, at least. Long term, who knows? But short term. So they need us for that. They need us to give them, experiential activities. They need us to give them knowledge structures, everything from ontologies to recipes to common everyday wisdom. They'll need all of that. And so those are the sorts of things that we need to produce. And what that means is work, knowledge-based work in the future won't be about producing the knowledge so much, because the computer can do that. Work in the future will be creating these communities, as previously defined, that work with this knowledge and do things with it and build a society out of it and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And then that goes back to ChatGPT. And I know that's really hand wavy. And that's because you're asking, what is the practical implication of the future technology? And it's just, there's so many possibilities there.
Yeah.
The practical implementation is, for example, it could help us address climate change. But we need to tell the AI that addressing climate change is important. That's up to us. Well, I say that, and then I ask, well, maybe it'll learn that by itself, because it will be able to determine, that climate change is bad, because we'll have deontic analytics. But not all systems will know this, right? So to a certain degree, we'll need to be able to change that. But values and structures, modes of interaction, creation of communities, different ways of determining sources of truth, basically the act of having a society, hopefully a functioning society, is what we do to instruct these systems. So the slogan form is, we will all have to become teachers. Right? Not just teaching each other, although that's been, of course, our occupation for the last 3,000, 4,000 years, but now teaching our artificial intelligences. But teaching isn't something that just teachers will do. It'll be something that the entire community does. So all of us think, working together as a community, will have to have in our minds the idea that we are teaching the machines. And that'll be one of the primary economic activities of the future. It might be almost the economic activity of the future. Teach the machines.
So there's a shock headline here. Not less teachers, more teachers. Good news for the industry.
Well, good news for the industry in a sense, although if everybody is a teacher, nobody's a teacher, right? It means the end of the profession, right? Oh. It's kind of like healthcare, right? You could have healthcare that was done only by healthcare professionals. But really, if you want to have a healthy society, everybody in society has to take healthcare, as something that they do, that they participate in. They have to eat well, they have to exercise, they have to not smoke or drink to excess, etc. All of these practices. So you don't need doctors to tell you anymore, you shouldn't be smoking, right? Everybody should know that. It should become a social activity. And so the role of the doctor sort of becomes narrower and narrower, and it almost becomes about the role of the doctor becomes that of teacher, because what you're trying to do is tell people how to be health conscious. Or it becomes like that of the mechanic, right? How do you fix something when it's broken? And so the same thing for teachers, right? So it's almost like the role of the teacher will become to teach other people how to be teachers. But that's kind of like saying it'll be to teach other people how people and machines learn.
Right.
But you can't just tell them. First of all, nobody believe you. I've learned that from experience. Right. But you have to show them, which means going back to, the whole idea, and this is Stephen's theory of education: to teach is to model and demonstrate, to learn is to practice and reflect. And I say theory very ironically, because none of this is original to me, and it's not even much of a theory. But that's basically what teaching is, right? It's not delivering instruction anymore. It's modeling and demonstrating good practice.
Okay.
And we're modeling and demonstrating practice, not just for the machines, although, yeah, we want to model and demonstrate for the machines, but for the rest of society. So if I want people to share, for example, their intellectual process, I don't tell them, you should share your intellectual process, because that's stupid. They'll say, why would you do that? No, I have to go out and actually share my intellectual process in something like Stephen follows instructions. And then they'll look at that and say, well, I can do a lot better than that, because anyone can, really. And then they start doing the same sort of thing. And so that's what teaching becomes. It's almost like becoming model citizens in a post-industrial society. And, what's the business model for that? What the classes look like? I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that follows from that, but that's the starting point, right?
So my next question was, perhaps in the light of that can't be answered really, but taking all these technologies into account, metaverse, blockchain and AI, could you paint us a picture of the university in the future, if indeed it has a future, or do we just see that dissolving and becoming something else, which is more learner driven? I don't know.
So depends on what you mean by university. That's a classic philosophical answer, doesn't it?
Yes, thank you, Socrates.
So let's deconstruct a little bit. To many people, the university is the administrative structure that we call a university, run by a board, maybe president, vice president, an academic senate or faculty's council. Everybody gathers in one place, either physically or or increasingly more commonly digitally. Formalized courses and programs, that administrative structure. I'd argue we're not really going to need that in the future. What would we use it for? Why, as we develop these consensus-based governance models, community as consensus, the need shifts from this formal structure to one of these consensus-based communities. And again, I'm skipping over a whole ton of details here, but to get the trend, right? So we don't need that formal structure. And indeed, as Governor Santos in Florida showed in his attempts to make a liberal arts university a conservative university, that kind of structure can be abused and has been abused. People view that almost, and not necessarily incorrectly, as kind of a propaganda device. It's a bit extreme to state, but there are very definite intentions with that kind of structure, and as has always been the case with schooling, whether the lowercase or the lower grades or the higher grades. And again, many comments on skipping over what is the role of Eton in a society, why are leaders of society, why do they come from Cambridge and Oxford, or in Canada from St. Francis Xavier, etc. There's all kinds of roles that these universities play that we don't need anymore and really could do without. The other activities, though, we still need people to I don't want to say create knowledge because the machines will do that, um, but to, and I don't want to say create community because large groups of people do that, but to be the inspirations for these communities. Still need that, right? You still need people messing around on the edge of technology or the frontiers of thought beyond anything that's practical, and coming back with whatever they have and sharing it with the world, preferably not through subscription-based publications. Still need that. We need that for a variety of reasons. The main one is we can have experiences that our knowledge producing machines can't have, simply by virtue of the fact that we're human. We're always going to have distinct kind of experiences, and our job as academics will be to go out and have those experiences. That's not a business proposition. You can't create a business out of it. It has to be a function that is socially supported. So as a society, we need to agree that that's important, and then we need to agree to pay for it. So that's part of it. The learning part of it, again, the knowledge bit, all of knowledge is either online already or will be online shortly. Learning materials and learning resources are already beginning to be produced by AI. So, I mean, if you're an instructional designer or whatever, your career is in trouble, right? Because the AI can do it better. What you want to be is the person who runs the AI that mass produces these instructional designs for the short period of time that we still have instructional designs. So all of that's available. But we still, again, need people in learning communities to model and inspire these learning communities. And, when we did the CMOOC back in 2008, the model that I described to George and others was to almost try to go back to the pre-industrial model of university training, where the students basically formed their own societies and managed their own education. And the professors would do their professor things. But from time to time, the students would convince a professor to hold forth on a topic over a number of sessions, to, if you will, deliver a course of lectures, the lecture being the prime communication mechanism at the time. Today, we might do it differently, might not be a course of lectures, but it's the same sort of thing, right? A group of people would get together and invite an academic or 2 or 10 to hold forth on these over a sequence of time. And that's what we tried to do with the CMOOC. So it was a community. It was a community of learners. We tried to make that community of learners as self-organizing as possible, and then seed that community with this course of lectures. Except they weren't really lectures, but they were online learning activities. And it wasn't the case where we would deliver a lecture and then test the students on it, because that's not how the structure went, right? That wasn't the point. Rather, it's more like the students were asking us a series of questions. We'd offer our best answers to them, and then the students go back and do whatever. And then in that model, at the end of that process, when they think they're ready, they go to their instructors and say, well, I think I'm ready now to be a doctor. Let me prove it to you. I'll write something. I'll have an examination, and then you're done. I think there's a lot more merit to that method than the method that we're using today.
And it's interesting that there are a lot of echoes there of universities in Adam Smith's time, where the students would pay the lecturers, and if they weren't any good, they wouldn't bother to pay for them. This is absolutely fascinating. I think you've laid out a really interesting vision for the university. It raised a lot of interesting and challenging perspectives. And I'm only sorry that we have the tyranny of time and have to wrap up now. But I'd really like to thank you for taking the time today, Stephen. Just lastly, where's the best place for people to go and find out more about your work at the moment? Where are you communicating most?
My website is www.downs.ca, and that's your starting point. Okay. And then from there, I have my newsletter, my videos, etc., etc.
Lovely. Thank you very much for taking the time today.
Oh, you're very welcome.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to our sponsors. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship and your Patreon contributions. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube. And you can contribute at patreon.com/learninghack.
The themes roundup we promised before Christmas never quite happened because we all got hideous colds and flu, but we're over that now, and huzzah! The new season of Great Minds on Learning starts up next week with an episode on AI learning. It's a corker, don't miss it. The next learning hack is on leadership learning. Is it just a bunch of woke fridge magnet slogans? Gustav Nordbeck answers the haters. Till then,
stay curious, learning people!
Now I finally get it.